at teaching what it is they want to teach. Okay? And the third disclaimer I have is I am pregnant. And I am so absent-minded. I do think that when you're pregnant, the baby like sucks, right? Okay, you guys know what I'm talking about. It takes part of your brain.
Never gets it back.
And it does. Don't tell me that. I'm hoping. When this is over, I might have. But I'm forgetful, and so I'm probably going to be looking at my notes a little bit more than usual, and I may remember something and then go back to it. I'm going to try to stay on track, but I've been told that I'm a little forgetful right now. So I just want to throw that one out there. Okay, next one. You know what I mean? Okay, so basically what we're going to be talking about is the difference between homeschool curriculum and public school curriculum. What's the big deal? What's the big difference? Because I'm pretty sure that, we can all agree that the environment, that's just a given. It's not a good environment. You got that many kids in one environment, and they're all kind of the blind leading the blind. And the teacher, first of all, it's not really their job to be the parent, but also just to try to get involved in everything that's going on. It's impossible. Okay, so we're just not even going to cover that. We're going to go to the curriculum, because that's something I think is really overlooked. And a lot of people, they don't get, well, what's the big deal with what they're teaching them? It's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. How bad could that go, right? So we're going to talk about how bad that can go. And we're going to pick two specific examples. One is going to be from history, and one is going to be from science. There's a lot of examples that we could do, but I'm just going to pick one, just so you can kind of see, if we just pick one, how different it can be taught, and what the consequences are of how it's taught. And I want to clarify, too, that when I'm talking about homeschool curriculum, I'm really talking about Christian homeschool curriculum. Because again, there's a big difference. I can go get a book. I got these books on Amazon, public school books, and I can use them at home. Okay, but then I'm not giving them a Christian education. I'm homeschooling them, but I'm using the same stuff that they use in the public schools. Okay, so when I'm comparing these two, I'm doing public school material that they use in the public schools that I have got recent copies of that I bought online, and we're going to be referring to them, versus homeschool curriculum that is Christian-based. Okay, and that's the big difference. And we're going to talk about just those two specific examples and how different they are. All right. Okay, so our first example is going to be George Washington. George Washington, I have to say, this is really when I was homeschooling, when I got to this early American history stuff, that I'm like, I was never taught this. What? Are you kidding me? It was such a mind-blowing experience to learn things about our founding fathers that I was never taught in the public school system. Okay? Now I'm going to take this, and I picked 7th grade just because it was kind of in the middle, and I just, and you're in 7th grade. I did it for my son, about that. But I picked it, and so everything that we're doing right here is going to be based on 7th grade curriculum. So I want to just look up here. George Washington, he is mentioned 177, here we go. He is talked about right here. Okay, it says, George Washington, who was from Virginia, was chosen as the commanding general for the Continental Army. Okay, most of us know that, right? He served as a colonial officer with the British during the French and Indian War. Okay, most people know that too. Okay, that's it. And then his name is kind of mentioned sporadically when it comes to he led them into this battle, and then he led them into that battle, and then they didn't win this battle. And his name's just kind of mentioned sporadically, so keep that in mind, okay? He was put in charge of the Continental Army, and he was in the French and Indian War, okay? So I looked a little bit more, and I found that they actually had a little side note on a page over here where it had his picture, and underneath it, it says history makers, America's history makers, and there was a little section on George Washington. Okay, this is where they're really going to get into who he was and, you know, what kind of person he was, right? And it says, at the age of 16, George Washington worked as a surveyor, setting land boundaries in the wilderness. He learned to handle hardship by hunting for food and sleeping outdoors. And in the French and Indian War, Washington had many brushes with death. The war made him the most famous American officer. This is all there is on George Washington in this book. This is a book that covers early American history. And what it tells us about George Washington was he was a surveyor, he camped out, he was a leader of the army, and he was in the French and Indian War. And that's about it. That's it. This is what I learned about George Washington in public school. I mean, I was like, okay, he was our first president, you know, big deal, right? What they don't say is that George Washington was a God-fearing, righteous man who referred to our Heavenly Father in almost every single letter and every single speech he ever gave. Ever. Now, I don't know if some of you homeschoolers have gotten there yet, but it blew my mind that when I went and got books that were not put out by the public school system, from the library and books on his own writing, I was just shocked. Every letter he's talking about our Heavenly Father, and you know, only by God's mercy, and on and on and on. And it talked about how he prayed during these battles in front of his men. He would let them see him pray. And he was such a godly man. And I'm thinking, how could they not mention that? Oh, because they can't mention that. Because they can't. Right? Separation of church and state. State government. Can't talk about that. Right? I'd like my son actually to come up here and read. This is an excerpt from a letter that he wrote when he was resigning his presidency. And I want you to keep in mind, too, that something else I was not taught in public school was that they actually wanted to make him King George. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but they wanted him to just take over. He was doing such a great job. He was doing a great job. And he said, no, we need to give this back to the people. And this is when he's finally resigning from public life.
I have thus freely disclosed what I wish to make known, before I surrendered up my public trust to those who committed it to me. The task is now accomplished. I now bid to you, Excellency, as the Chief Magistrate of your state. At the same time, I bid a last farewell to the cares of office and all the employments of public life. It remains then to be my final and only request that your Excellency will communicate these sentiments to your legislature at their next meeting, and that they may be considered as the legacy of one who has ardently wished on all occasions to be useful to his country, and who, even in the shade of retirement, will not fail to implore the divine benediction upon it. I now make it my earnest prayer that God would have you and the state over which you preside in his holy protection, that he would incline the hearts of the citizens to cultivate a spirit of subordination and obedience to the government, to entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another, for their fellow citizens of the United States at large, and particularly for their brethren who have served in the field, and finally, that he would most graciously be pleased to dispose us all to do justice, to love mercy, and to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion, and without a humble imitation of whose example in these things we can never hope to be a happy nation.
Thank you, Todd. You go down if you want. Thanks. And this was typical of what he would say. I mean, I actually have some free CDs back there from Richard Boyer, and him and his family have written a book, and then they do speeches and they travel around, basically trying to educate people on the fact that our founding fathers were Christians. They were Christians, and that they didn't hide it. Every time they spoke, I mean, listen how this is kind of scary to think. Without humble imitation of whose example in these things, if we are not acting like Jesus, we can never hope to be a happy nation. How true. Look where we are now. George Washington knew this, and he said it out loud. And he didn't care who heard him. Okay? So it's really a disservice, and it was making me angry. When I was finding this stuff out and I was teaching my kids, I was like, I was cheated. I was cheated out of knowing who George Washington really was. And it's not just George Washington. I mean, the more I learned about who these people were, our founding fathers, it shocked me. We were a Christian nation. And it's just no wonder that these kids are growing up now not believing that. It's because they're not taught it. Something else that was interesting about the history is when I looked in the index for Jesus Christ or Christ, there's no mention, there's nothing. Christians, there's no mention, there's nothing. There's one mention for church. And when I looked it up, it is actually a few sentences on the Mormon church. And it talks about how they were persecuted and their leader was murdered and they all fled, and it was just this horrible, awful thing, poor Mormons. That is the only mention of church in this book. And actually, I'm going to read this to you too. There's one mention of homeschooling. I just looked that up for fun. I thought that'd be funny. And it says, poor children. It's talking about the different types of schooling. It talks about that most children were only taught to read so that they can only understand the Bible. Those poor children. If they had money, they could go to private tutors and things like that. And then it says poor children. These poor children sometimes learn to read from their mothers. That's sad. I'm a little upset. I mean, where's the ACLU on that? I'm a little offended. Being a homeschooler here, But that's it. This is going to be the gist of what they get in 7th grade. This is really where it started for me, where I really started to understand the difference in the substance of what they were being taught in the public school versus what you can teach in homeschool. Go to the next one. The Big Bang Theory. In the beginning, there was nothing, which exploded. I love that. The Big Bang Theory. Here, I'm going to go straight to again. This is a physical science book, Holt, from California. I got it on Amazon. Okay, this is what the 7th graders are using. And we will read about, really quick, what they say about the Big Bang Theory. Okay. it says that the scientists know that the universe is expanding, and so they worked backward in time to figure out how the universe formed.